All right. So we are recording, and we are going to move forward to taking a moment just to take a deep breath. And I'm having a very, very busy week, and so it's a good practice, a good discipline for me to just stare at that flame for a few seconds and really focus my mind and my energy on this time and this work and the story that we are creating together. So our reading today is by Sophia Lyon-Fahs, and I'm fairly certain that most of you are familiar with that name. Hopefully you are familiar with her story from having done some of the reading. But this is a reading that is in our hymnal, and I'd love it if a couple folks, yeah, I think it's 3 pages. So if we could get 3 readers.
Since I have a new microphone,
all right, why don't you take the first one, and then somebody else just raise your hand for page 2. Meredith and Terry. Okay.
What number is it in?
Meredith,
it's the slides.
Yeah, it's on the slides.
Oh, I don't have the slides open.
Okay, it's 657. 57.
Hold on a sec. I can get the slides.
it matters what we believe. Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged. Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way into wider and deeper sympathies. Some beliefs are like shadows clouding children's gaze with fears of unknown activity. Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with, that's as far as I can see,
the warmth of happiness.
Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies. Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern. Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction. Other beliefs are like getaways, opening wide vistas, Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration.
Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness. Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth. Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world. Other beliefs are pliable, like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life.
Wonderful. I think one of the things that has always amazed me about Sophia Lyon-Fahs is just how her words and her ideas continue to be so relevant to our time. So I love that reading, and I think it has come around again to be very, very meaningful. Sadie.
Yes, can you stop screen sharing, Kat, and then I will share the timeline.
I will.
Perfect. And here we go. And there she is. We're just talking about her. So we'll see this picture, and we'll see Sophia Lyon-Fahs a few times on this timeline. This shows our timeline begins with her birth, 1876. And so a review, she was a humanist and a proponent of child-centered progressive educational techniques. She also saw religious and spiritual inspiration in the experience of life and in the shared stories and scriptures of people of many cultures, places, and times. Or in her words, life is religious if we make it so. She was developmental editor of the remarkable New Beacon series, which was published between 1937 and 1964. And, oh, there we go. Because both Unitarians and Universalist congregations used the New Beacon series for years, her effect on the movement is deep. The common religious education metaphors, stories, and experiences smoothed the way to the eventual consolidation of the AUA and the UCA. Foz was ordained as a minister when she was 82. So, wow. So we got to read some of those stories about her in our session. Again, here, if you want to go to one of the Tapestry of Faith stories about her, you can click on that link. The other religious educator that we learned about, Angus Hector McLean. McLean was the dean of the Theological School of St. Lawrence University. He emphasized the value of using progressive educational approaches to religious education, and his idea of how we are taught should be in line with what we are taught. And his method is the message has been axiomatic of the Unitarian Universalist religious education. His call for our institutions and structures to better reflect our open faith is still relevant today. And James Luther Adams. The idea that our religion is revealed in our actions and not our beliefs was paramount to the Unitarian theologian and professor of Christian ethics, James Luther Adams. Known to many as JLA, he bridged the theological divide between Unitarian Christians and humanists, teaching that what we do as a result of what we believe is what really matters, urging people of faith to make their voices heard in the public square. And one of our readings was about his 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism. And in my other room, I have 5 large stones, which I've written on them, his messages, and it's a great tool to use with all ages. Okay. Ethelred Brown serves Harlem Unitarian Church. We learned about him last session as well, but he's also on this timeline. So this is, he was born in 1920 to 1957. He was the first Black Unitarian minister. We learned before how he came from Jamaica and pursued Unitarian ministry in New York. In 1920, he returned and founded the Harlem Unitarian Church, and he received little help from the AUA and worked extra jobs to make ends meet. The AUA revoked his, this doesn't make any sense, and dropped Brown from fellowship in 1929. With the help of the ACLU and a threat of a lawsuit, Brown's fellowship with the AUA was reinstated. So it's a little bit more about his story. So in this timeline as well, in 1933, this is when the Humanist Manifesto came out. It offered a full embrace of human agency and capacity to address the world's problems. Among the signers were 15 Unitarian ministers and 1 Universalist. So we talked about this last session, but it's definitely in the timeline that we're still discussing this time around. One of McLean's publications, The New Era in Religious Education, was a child-centered, experience-centered, rather than a biblical-centered approach, which we can see that influencing our work today. Unitarians Face a New Age. This was the first commission on appraisal for the AUA, and it made it clear that humanism was now the dominant theological position of the movement, which again, this is from last session, but it's in this timeline. And again, Hymns of the Spirit. This was the Universalist and the Unitarian first collaboration on a joint hymnal. And this was one of the first hymnals that included non-theist hymns. And if you got to the end of the reading that talked about the women in religion section, this hymnal was criticized and worked on to avoid sexist language in the following hymnal. So this is came up in this session's reading as well as last session's. So Frederick May Elliott, he bridges the gap between the Unitarian humanists, theists, and Christians. He worked within the AUA to foster courageous social action, spiritual development, and church extensions. This is a little bit more about the New Beacon series that came out from 1937 to 64. We talked about this, how she co-authored over dozens of books in this series, and because which I've already said, because both Unitarians and Universalists use this series, it created sort of a common language and common understanding together. Some of the titles include Martin and Judy from Long Ago in Many Lands, which is still published and you can still get at the UUA bookstore. Animal Babies, Jesus the Carpenter's Son, and Across the Church Across the Street. Martha and Waitzel Sharp, they aided Jewish refugees. Unitarian Service Committee commissioners, they traveled to Europe during World War II to help Jews and non-Jews, intellectuals and political leaders, writers, artists, and children flee to safety from the Nazis. There is a video about their story, and more is coming out about them. I think there's a new documentary coming out about them soon as well. Church of the Large O Fellowship was founded in 1944, and it served isolated religious liberals through the mail, and now it's still going strong. And it's not just through the mail, but it definitely has an online presence. And here, within 2 years, it had over 1,500 people in correspondence. The Humilati, which was formed by 7 Korean theological students, and they sought to make universalism more universal and began using the symbol of the off-centered cross to show the circle of their faith has has room for more than just Christianity. And I believe this reading may not have been in your current reading, but I wanted to keep this in the timeline. One, because I couldn't edit the timeline because of the software, but this is where the symbol of the off-centered cross comes from, which I think is fascinating. This is more of the fellowship movement. Moreau Husbands begins leading the fellowship movement in 1948. Husbands traveled to communities around the country to help set up lay-led fellowships. And many use the New Beacon series for their religious education programs. And I am curious to find out if any of your congregations you serve were part of the fellowship movement. Kenneth Patton's Charles Street Meeting House may not have been in your reading, but it's also another fascinating read and piece of our history. He was a Universalist minister and innovator and prolific writer. A lot of his work is in our hymnal. The meeting house, his pews were set up in the round with a painted earth on the center of the floor and symbols of world religions on the walls. There are books and a globe at the altar, and new readings and hymns were created for this congregation. Their hymnal was like a 3-ring binder where he would add new hymns that he wrote for each service. Patton was prolific and controversial in his pushing boundaries for what it meant to be Universalist. In 1950, we learned in our reading about the candidacy of Eugene Sparrow. He was the first Black man to graduate from Harvard Divinity School, but he was not welcome to serve any Unitarian church beyond the assistant minister for 1 year at the Unitarian Church of Somerville. The only church where he candidated in Detroit voted not to welcome Sparrow as the assistant minister, and he became a teacher instead. In 1952, this is Today's Children and Yesterday's Heritage, one of Sophia Lyon-Faz's publications. And the Council of Liberal Churches was from 1953 to 1961, founded by Unitarians and Universalists to work together on religious education, publications, and youth ministry, one step closer on the journey to consolidation. The Universalist Church of the Philippines, I also don't think this was in this session's reading, but it was in the previous version of this module. And I want to pronounce his name correctly, but I don't know it. But it looks like it's Toribio Quimada of the Universal Church of Christ of the Philippines. He asked for help from churches in the Ecumenical Dictionary under U. He sent a letter to the United States, and the Universalist Service Committee was the only church that wrote him back, and they sent him back a collection of books. And he was soon excommunicated from his church for his new liberal Christian views. He founded the Universalist Church of the Philippines, and 9 congregations joined him. His ministry included advocating for the poor, helping farmers gain deeds for their lands. Sadly, he was murdered in 1988, just before he was going to travel to the US for General Assembly to receive recognition with the Unitarian Universalist Association. And for more, I definitely recommend learning more about his story when you have time at this link. Okay, so the UCA and the AUA consolidate, forming the UUA in 1959. The final negotiations were worked out in Syracuse, New York. Over the next year, a plebiscite of congregations was called. 95% of the Unitarians and Universalist congregations participated. 88% of Unitarians said yes, 79% of Universalists said yes. In 1960, the separate but side-by-side annual meetings voted yes to consolidation. A special worship service, I think this is fascinating, was held at Boston Symphony Hall, and the pulpits, using the pulpits previously used by William Ellery Channing and Hosea Ballou. And this is when the Hymns for Celebration of Life, the new hymn, the joint hymnal, was published. And the last publication on this timeline is one of Maclean's The Wind in Both Ears. He thought on religion and its evolution and the strengths and weaknesses of Unitarian Universalism. And for more on that, and I think excerpts from that, you can click on the link. And that is a little review of not everything that you read today, but quite a lot. So thanks for bearing with me. I know you guys did a lot of reading, and so I hope this review is helpful. And let's go to our next section. Pat, do you have the...
All right, let's bring this back. So we're going to talk a little bit about, there's a couple questions here, but there was a lot happening in this period, both organizationally and institutionally. The AUA, the American Unitarian Association, and the UCA, the Unitarian Convention, Universalist Convention of America, I think, or whatever, UCA and the AUA, the two bodies. There was actually a lot of discussion, and it happened over decades, of whether these two faith movements could actually combine, partner, and really become one. So there was a lot happening in the background around that, but there was a lot of collaboration, as I think you may have heard from your reading, on the religious education side. And as so often happens, the religious educators and the youth community were really leading the way, were really leading by their actions this coming together of Unitarian and Universalists. And in that, they were also really instrumental, I think, in articulating and naming the liberal theology that was to become Unitarian Universalism. And so that's kind of the big story of this particular period from our point of view. And certainly Sophia Lyon-Fahs, as I said at the beginning, 100 years later, her impact is still so fresh. Her ideas are still, we talk sometimes in religious education circles about, well, gosh, what's next? We're at this turning point, and how are we going to do religious education in the 21st century? And sometimes when we go back to the source and go back to the work of Sophia Fahs, we find out that a lot of what she was doing was way, way ahead of the 20th century context in which she was operating. So it's been a little bit hard for us to figure out how to move beyond that. But I want to give us an opportunity to just share some thoughts on these two questions. So first, what ideas and practices from this particular period of the timeline, mid-20th century, around the time of consolidation, what do you think is still reflected in our work and in Unitarian Universalism today? Let's hear from a couple of folks.
Well, I just wanted to say that I was a philosophy and history major in college, and my husband was a philosopher. I met my husband in college, and he was a philosophy major as well. And we both really, really enjoyed pragmatism and John Dewey and William James. And I have to think that William James was an influence on John Dewey, were, the foremost philosophers in that vein at that time. And I have to think that foundation for those two educators, for Sophia Foz and I can't remember the gentleman's name. McLean on the Universalist side, that really was kind of this behind the scenes ways to influence the entire denomination. I mean, and also speaks to me personally why this faith in particular resonates with me. So that was kind of, I guess, for people who find this tradition on their own and are come-outers, as we like to call them, that pragmatic approach, I think, is very appealing to people. That it's not about what you believe, but how those beliefs then inform your actions. And I think that's something that, is very unifying for folks too, that we can look to that rather than something else. So that was my takeaway.
Great. Thank you. Bart had his hand up.
So first I have to apologize. I am sick, coming off of summer seminary, post-event sickness. I think some of the ideas and practices from mid-20th century liberal religion is the extent of humanism within our congregations, and how deep that runs. I'd also say that our commitment to pacifism, or those within our congregations who are committed to pacifism, is a huge chunk from that era. And I think we're actually seeing that change with our youth nowadays, but that's a separate conversation. And I think that just American culture in general kind of idealizes the 50s, at least white American culture does. And I think that we see that reflected in the older members of our congregations who lived it and have that experience as well. And I think that when we look at religious education, or the history of our faith through religious education, what we see is a different story. We see a story through women's eyes, through the youth's eyes. And, the other thing that I want to end on is that, the youth pulling together our faith in the late 50s, is something that we see now as well, and we practice as well, that our youth have always been on the forefront of our progressive movements and on making this faith more progressive and better for everyone involved.
Great. Thanks, Bart. Courtney had her hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've got a new setup today. So I was, what struck me about how the mid-20th century and now, that I actually felt a little upset by, was how disorganized we are. Mm-hmm. And it comes from a wonderful, I think it's the challenge that everybody has with, if you want it organized, you have authority. If you don't want authority, you have to give up some organization and some leadership. And that's what I felt we are still struggling with a little bit. And I don't think that anyone in our congregation, at least, wants more authority, but we also want that organizational, hi Meredith. Yeah, we also want that organizational track so that we do feel a little more united.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. What a great insight. Thanks, Courtney. Anybody else on this first question? How about the second question? What difference does it make if we put religious education and faith development in the center of the way we tell our Unitarian Universalist story? Which I think is a great question.
I'll take a crack at that.
Great.
Well, the difference, one of the differences it makes is that it gives us an opportunity to broaden our appeal. I forget what the exact statistic is on how many Americans believe in some sort of God, but it's well over, I think it might be 90 or 95%. And if our congregations are not focused or don't offer faith development, I don't think we're going to appeal to, we're never going to grow, we'll probably shrink. And of course, religious education is a very important avenue for bringing new families in. I think there are, young couples are looking for an ecumenical, non-dogmatic religious education for their young children, and we're the best game in town when it comes to that.
Mm. Yeah.
I would say it does two things. I think, first of all, it's a more truthful reflection of of how the UU story developed, in that where we learned in this session how the forward-thinking nature and actions of of religious educators were able to help with the progression of this movement. And then I also think that if you put that at the center of who we are, I think it helps us to become more forward-thinking and more future-focused, because it says we're going to ask people to think deeply about their beliefs and what that means for the world, and how that is beyond their own needs, and helps establish, how we think about what mark we're going to leave on the world.
Mm.
So that's my thought.
That's great. I think depth, the use of the word depth is really important. We don't, in our congregations, sometimes require depth of spiritual practice, depth of reflective discernment, depth of learning about the history of who we are and where we come from and how we came to be. In our congregations, we sometimes tend to focus more on organizational pieces, leadership and the work of the board and the work of committees. And really, our work is to grow a spiritually mature people. And sometimes we're out of balance in our congregation. And if we really focus on that learning and growing for all ages, I think we would be more effective in our action and in our organizational work. Deborah,
yeah, I'm going to jump in. I'm not sure how I raised my hand, but
all right.
I guess I'm just thinking about how, if you think of the life cycle of institutions and then you superimpose that with the human life cycle, that a lot of creativity and innovation is often associated with youth or being younger. And partly that's because social constructs start to squash that out of people, right? It's not that everyone loses that ability, but people learn how to fit in socially. So if we think about UU history, it's almost like we would be cutting out our ancestors if we start cutting out youth, or the idea of questioning comes to me that it's very natural when you're younger to be able to focus more on questions than on answers. And so somehow that's to me, it's our lifeblood, bringing us, from those early Unitarians and Universalists, and I in my mind should just be considered the life of a fellowship, of a congregation. It's the life force that can keep reminding us to question.
Oh, I love that. It's the life force of the congregation. That's great. Any other thoughts on either of these questions? They're good questions. That first one, to just sort of keep that in the back of your mind, and as you go about your work, and as you are hearing stories and writing stories and thinking about our history, the narrative of our history, just to ask stop and sort of reflect on that question as you go. I think it's a good one to keep in mind. Okay. Sadie, do you want to take us to our next?
Yes, I'd love to. This is one of my favorite parts of the class.
It is.
I have a lot of favorites, but this is definitely one of them. So as we read in our reading, both Unitarians and Universalists work to spread their message differently. And but by the mid-20th century, the Universalist missionaries, their efforts had dwindled, and the Unitarians began working through the fellowship movement. And they were still planting congregations at that time. So I'm very curious to find out. We never know necessarily what the histories of the congregations that you are all familiar with, what they are. So we'd love to have a chance to hear from some of you if you know the origin story of your congregation. Did it start as a fellowship? Do you know if it was started by a missionary? Does it have long-time roots that it started with one of the churches of the Standing Order, starting as a congregational church, then turning Unitarian? So what I would love to do here is to try and hear from people who haven't had a chance to speak yet, if they have stories that they can share. And what we can do is just, I would love you to step up if you haven't had a chance yet and to share a story if you have one. And then if everyone from that group has spoke, then we can hear from folks that haven't had a chance, that have already spoken. So
I also see we have a 908 number. Is that Michelle? I just want to know who's here. Michelle, have you joined us?
Yes, I have. That's me.
Okay, very good.
Hey. So who would like to share for a few minutes about a congregation's origin story? Do you guys know where your congregations came from? A little bit about their history?
The congregation that I'm serving right now, I haven't gotten totally clear on the history, but my understanding is that it was formed largely coming out of so we're on the north side of Chicago, which is kind of the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. And there was really serious housing discrimination. And it seems that this congregation kind of came out of some activism work against the racial discrimination related to housing in this area.
Do you know when the congregation began?
I think it was in the 60s.
In the 60s. Fascinating. Neat. Thank you, Meredith. Who else has a story about their congregation?
So I think the congregation I serve as a DRE came out of the fellowship, but I don't really know the history so I'll have to do that research and talk to people a little more. I think it was the 1960s. But that's in Rockland County, New York. The one I'm a member of goes back officially to 1870, but they started across the river in Beacon, then Fishkill Landing, New York, in 1830 by the granddaughter of John Adams. They were Unitarians, her and her husband, and they got excommunicated from the Dutch Reformed Church. So they started their own church, and they invited the uncle of William Ellery Channing, Henry Channing, to come preach. And then they invited a lot of other traveling Unitarian ministers. They're the oldest congregation in the Hudson Valley. Most of the other congregations started much, much later, mostly the 50s and 60s, or a couple in the, I think Yonkers was the 1800s. But then they eventually became joined with a group of Universalists across the river who were floundering financially, so they joined together, but the Unitarians kind of dominated. And in 1970, moved west again to a little suburb, and were lay-led. So they kind of went through all these different transitions and eventually got a minister in the coming out of the congregation in the 2000. So they kind of have they act a little like a fellowship.
Yeah.
They have a part-time minister, but they have a long history.
They do. Oh, that is a fascinating journey there. And does the congregation really know its story?
You know, a lot of it, they've had so many fights. They had a fire in 2006 that burned a lot of records, and they had a fire when they were in Fishkill Landing, too, that burned a lot of the records. So that we have the story on our website, but I think we've had so many new people and transplants, it's hard sometimes to keep telling the story. And yeah, so we've told pieces of it, but yeah, keep telling it.
So cool. Yeah. Thanks for telling it. Great. All right. Any other stories?
This is Deborah. I can tell you a little bit about ours. I think the version that exists today started in 1961, so it's right as part of the fellowship movement. But what's interesting is that its actual historic roots go back to 1850, and they were Universalists. And in the 1850s, there were enough people to organize the Universalist Church that starting in 1860, that 26 people or so, and then they incorporated in 1865 and built the first church by 1865. But they kind of dwindled after that and dwindled away, so that by the 1930s they were completely dissolved. And then in 1951, a woman who was married to a local doctor who started one of our big medical centers that exists now in La Crosse, she started a Universalist group in 1951. And it's around about that time, I think it was that same year, that in La Crosse they gave her the Man of the Year award, which is really interesting to me. And then they met for 10 years in the Y building, and then when they became Unitarian Universalists in 1961. From 1961 to 2004, they basically just conducted meetings somewhere, and it wasn't until 2007 that they actually got their own building.
Oh, wow.
So you could, for our fellowship, you could almost say yes to all the questions, right? Because they've been part of it. And one thing that I found that was fascinating that I didn't know is that in between 1895 and 1905, La Crosse was the largest Universalist congregation in Wisconsin. So that's a big part of that history, but they kind of just dwindled away completely.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love we don't always have Universalists represented in our congregational sharing. And, it's great that they've come up in the past too. I love this. Thank you.
Well, and our local historical society, because we got them to come and do a service
Nice.
They have a quilt that was done in the 1860s where people wrote their names onto the quilt. It's unusual. It's not quilted. It's more drawn on, and you can see a lot of the founding members of La Crosse contributed to that, and they were universalists at that point.
Oh, wonderful.
So I would love to research that some more.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. Oh, so cool. Who else? Any other stories?
This is Michelle. I don't know a ton about our history. I'm actually really looking forward to learning more about it because this, January of 2017, I guess, is the 60th anniversary of the UU Congregation of Monmouth County getting their charter with the UUA.
Okay.
And so from what I understand, I guess like they really like started a few months before that, like maybe 6 months before that, because we were trying to decide like which date to celebrate. But they were like, I know they had like 10 founding members, and we still have one couple that is still living in a part of our congregation, and everyone else has since passed. And you know, from what I understand, they were like a powerhouse in terms of social justice. And it's interesting because they still, they were so involved in so many different movements, even starting a adjunct organization for low-cost childcare in the area, and like various other things. And they've since become, in terms of social justice, become a little disorganized, and but still see themselves as this, like, you know, powerhouse social justice congregation because of all of the things they were involved in the past. And I don't know when they got their first minister, but their first minister they had for 30 years. And it was early on, because their next minister was there for like, 10 or 12. And so they haven't had like a whole lot of ministers. And so, a lot of the people there still remember, that 30-year ministry. And so still fairly young. And I was just surprised when I did the math, because I guess I just assumed that the congregation came out after the merger, but when I did the math, it was like 5 years before. So now I'm interested to see more about that. And I think they were Unitarian to start.
Okay. Oh, cool. That's great. Thanks, Michelle. And happy 60th. And now, Scarlett, did you have your hand up?
Yes. Well, Home Church is relatively young. 25 years since the idea occurred this October. And let's say we became a full-fledged church for the UUA in October of 1993. We started out with one passionate person who went to the larger church in Rochester, who lived down on Canandaigua Lake, and Reverend Carl and Maureen Kitchener. Both of them are ministers in Amherst from Waterloo, Canada. They vacationed there, and they met her, and she said, I really want to start a church. And they held informational meetings at the library, and they got a big response. Like, I don't know, I think Canandaigua was not that big of a town, and they got like 30 people or something that came. So they just started meeting, and they met on Sunday afternoon at the library, and then they rented space in a couple of places, and they were growing. And I think they applied initially for a charter, and the UUA said, no, you don't have the right demographic. You can't be a church. But they kept going. That was the interesting part. And then they got their charter, and they fundraised and bought a building, a former Jehovah's Witness church, which is where we still are today. So we have a very little short timeline. But one of the things I want to say is that we do have a timeline. I think they started the timeline, creating it in the mid-90s, like maybe 96 or 97. Mm-hmm. And whenever we had new members join or, events, it gets put with a horizontal scroll timeline, and we bring it out several times a year and put it up around sanctuary on the walls, and people look at it, and new members go put their names in and the timeline and everything. So those of you, like Terry, your church is significantly older, that you could begin a timeline, the present, and then maybe find the things for the past, and slowly create a timeline of some type, or maybe maybe now you'd use I don't know, the paper one. We talk about turning it into a digital one, and everyone wants it on paper. Even though we have pictures of it to preserve it. If we do lose it. So that's our short history.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. Oh, I'm loving all these stories. What a great living history, and the visual of unrolling it and adding new members. That is so cool. And it's a true story of perseverance, and continuing in this, and having this congregation come on. That's awesome. Any other stories? We've got time for maybe one or two more.
We actually have time for more in the second half, so we really hope that we'll hear from everybody if you have a story.
Yeah.
I've got one.
I can talk about.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I can talk about our church's story because it just seemed exactly like the reading.
Cool.
We started in, I think the people who got together in the very late 60s, maybe 68, 69. We are approaching our 50th anniversary. And they met in a little elementary school, and there were just a lot of people who wanted to get together, and they called it, we live in Reston, the church is in Reston, they called it the Reston Community Church. And they, 4 years later, they had a building and joined in with the UUA and had a Unitarian Universalist minister. And so it really came from the people. It bubbled up from the community. And if you Reston is a very hippie, as a very generous, very utopian-oriented community with ideals of all people living together. So it was a really good primordial pond for something like this to happen.
Mm.
That's great. Thanks.
Next time I'm in Reston, I'll look around and try to imagine that it's a primordial pond.
We do have a lot of
I'm sitting in an hour and a half of traffic to get from point A to point B. Right?
Yeah.
All right.
All right. I can share my story later if it's almost time for our break. Or do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll share the story about the church that I'm a member of. I grew up in the Unitarian Church of All Souls in New York City, which has a several hundred-year history. They're actually going on 200 years. But I'm a member at the UU Church in Cherry Hill, and they were a typical fellowship church. They just celebrated their 60th anniversary, same as Monmouth County, and they actually they started out. It was a group of parents who attended the First Unitarian Church in Philadelphia, and just like this was in the mid 50s, and just like parents of today, they began to have difficulty getting their kids up and dressed and ready and able to cross the bridge and drive 45 minutes into the city in order to get the liberal religious education that they wanted for their family. So the parents gathered and began, actually, they started with a parent group, and they studied the books of Sophia Lyon-Fahs to really get, to steep themselves in liberal religious education, because that was what they needed for the families. And that was the primordial stuff out of which our congregation grew. So they started with, 10 families, 28 people. And within 3 years, they had, they were affiliating through the Unitarian Association. So many of the folks in this congregation worked for RCA. So there was a very humanist, engineer sort of brain that was prevalent in this group of charter members. And those things you can definitely see are still alive in the congregation today. And eventually they got a minister and that applied to be a real church. Because that was still the context. That was still the sort of the standard of 1959. The fellowship, they actually changed their name from the Unitarian Fellowship to the Unitarian Church. So what's one interesting piece is that recently, as many congregations have, they've undergone some budget challenges. And one of the ways that some folks in the congregation proposed to solve some of these budgetary issues was, of course, to cut the religious educator position. And another group of folks were successfully able to go back and say, wait a minute, religious education is what brought us together. So they used the congregation's history as a way of bringing the congregation back to say, hey, this is in our DNA. This is why we even exist, because religious education was integral to the lives of the families that started this church. And if we slash the budget and decide, I mean, they were really talking going from a full-time religious educator to a volunteer. They were talking a very large shift in thinking, and luckily we were able to stop that. But it was by going back to the history and bringing the story forward, that they were able to sort of reassess. So it was a good story.
That's a great story. Thanks, Pat. I've forgotten that.
Yeah.
Okay, and Jansen has his hand up. Is this another story, Jansen?
Yes.
Okay, you want to do it quick and then we'll go for a quick break?
Okay.
We have time. Yeah, take your time.
I grew up in the Mainline Unitarian Church in Devon, Pennsylvania. In many ways, the same story as Cherry Hill. Formed the same year or so by maybe a dozen families, including my parents, who were founding members. They had attended the Germantown Unitarian Church on the other side of Philadelphia. And so they rented space from a Methodist church in Berwyn. I was the first age group to go from infant through youth group there. And they changed to a church instead of fellowship, and instead of RCA, it was General Electric, where that supplied the wealthy members, and they were also very humanist. And when General Electric cut their budget and laid people off, it really hurt the church. We had to cut our minister's salary, and it took a number of years to recover from that. My mother is one of two remaining founding members there, and my daughter went through the entire RE program, and she's now 20 years old now.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jansen. I love the 3 generations in one congregation with your own. Oh, that's so cool. So neat. We really have been able to hear stories that relate to our readings this time around. That's really neat. So yeah, let's take a 5-minute break. So then I have 5:02 on my screen, so we'll come back at 5:07 and be ready to chat again. All right, have a good break, everyone.
So we are beginning to return to the second half of our session here. So we're going to just take a little time here to share on these two questions about how, sharing history in the work that we're doing in our congregations. And I know that we're sharing amongst, with each other in our reflections, but how can we take it a little bit further? And there's two questions, two kind of guiding questions for this conversation. I'll read them because we have people on the phone. So what did you learn from your reading that helped you to better understand a current program, movement, challenge, or event that affects your work as a religious educator? And how might knowing and sharing this information with others and this perspective help you in your work as a religious educator? So take a minute to reflect on those questions, and then we'll spend a few minutes hearing what folks are thinking. So who'd like to start us off? What impact does history have in the work that you're doing today?
Okay, I'm the one who absolutely can't take the silence. I'm sorry. So, if you don't mind hearing my voice again, I really love the conscientious objector information. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And a lot of the resistance and transformation pieces from Tapestry of Faith, I've been thinking about using that as an adult program, but I think I'm going to use it with our youth. I think that really speaks to the drive that youth have, and we I think Bart was talking about it earlier. The drive to make change, and they've got the energy. The rest of us we're tired. So I think that's it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
My pregnant
I think it was also
panic.
Deborah Eve. Yeah, Deborah Eve was also talking about that.
Yes.
As you live and breathe and work through a system, you follow a channel, and so it may seem as though the youth are doing all of the progressive thinking, but in fact, adults are differentiating, or they're hitting walls that stop that creative, innovative work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Terry, are you?
Yeah, I think so. All of it. There was so much information, and it was wonderful, to read all of it. But it was towards the end when I read the women in religion stuff that it kind of answered a question that had kind of been nagging me in the back of my head. Is, well, where did all of our current day, a lot of our spiritual practices, our earth ministry, the seventh principle, where did it all come from? That seemed it's been there, and it's a kind of a hidden strand. And then it's like even the chalice lighting came from the women in religion. And then our whole hymnal and the focus on earth ministry as well, coming out of that. I just found that very interesting, and something that because we do a lot of earth activism in the congregation in RE, and finding out, well, where did our seventh principle come from? Who brought that to light? So
great.
This is Deborah. I don't know if I'm bumping someone because I can't raise my hand, but one of the things that I've been really thinking about is about how Foz was someone who grew up cross-culturally, and it's, there's a lot of research that shows that people who grow up cross-culturally before the age of 18 really exist in a different kind of paradigm in terms of understanding society. So because she grew up in China when she was so young, and then she was American, but she had to come to the United States and then actually probably learn to be American when she was much older, that she, that's partly why she thinks about children more as being unique individuals and not just like small people who don't know anything. So I think a lot about, how this history really affects me is I am already very much committed to the fact that we, as a larger group of people, are not doing a really good job of thinking about class, because the whole of the United States doesn't really do a good job of that. And sometimes what we need for our survival is to hear more from people who are on the edges, so people who might not necessarily fit into our congregations. And we laugh a lot about what a Unitarian Universalist is and what they drive and how they dress, but that really is limiting who we think we are. And the more that we can reach out to these other perspectives, the more chance we have of keeping things alive and also becoming more viable and more relative. So that is something that I'm really thinking about. If you think about the people that have made huge impact on our larger group of very individualistic and very unique, and I don't think we have to lose any of that kind of idea behind it, but the people that are contributing to that very often are people who are bringing other ways of seeing the world or other ways of existing. And I have had a really hard time in the 4 years that I've been here in La Crosse, because I think I mentioned this before, we had a music director who was very specific about the kind of music and who could participate in making music. Mm-hmm. And she became absolutely irate when I invited someone to be a part of a multi-generational service, which I had to organize. So it wasn't like I was stepping on anyone's toes. I ended up having to do the whole thing. And I invited someone to perform who could not read music, who plays by ear. And she was absolutely furious. And it's that kind of thing that we're really good about, embracing difference in terms of things that you can maybe see in terms of race or gender, but some of our class difference is what we keep missing. And it's not just in a paternalistic way to be inclusive, but it's really understanding that those perspectives are so important in creating what it is that we want to become.
Yeah. Wow, great. Thank you, Deborah. So whoever's on 315, I saw that you had unmuted around the same time that Deborah Eve did. I'm not sure who that is. And did you have something that you wanted to share? I don't know who's on that number. They're unmuted again.
This is Scarlett, and no, I didn't have anything that I wanted to share at that moment.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, I didn't realize you were on both phone and. All right, Karina has her hand up.
I guess for me, the main takeaway was how religious education is a very fundamental type of social justice work, mm-hmm. and that those two things are really interrelated and integrated with each other. And I would really want to emphasize that message with our congregation for when they continue to feel like there needs to be an outreach component to what we do. And I fully agree with that, because that's very engaging and motivating for people, but it needs to be multi-generational, and it needs to be, and the way that we act with our children and model what we're doing with our youth will only, help whatever cause is coming down the pike be addressed more readily by youth that have grown up in an environment where that is the central, where their development is a key component of what we're trying to do in our congregation. So that was one thought. And then the other thought I had, I was very, I found Mark Morrison's read summary about the empowerment paradox. He called it empowerment paradox, I think, the empowerment saga. At the end, he just talks about how we need to get past perfectionism and just keep trying. And I really feel, and I have this in myself, is that you always want to make your best effort. And for me, that often means trying to plan for every contingency, and that can really keep you from making forward progress. And so if you give yourself some permission to do the best that you can, not knowing every single little thing that might, and to forgive each other for mistakes, I think is a really, really important lesson to learn from what happened during that time. And I really liked the way he summed that up, that we need to get past all of that. So yeah, that's a great quote.
And I love that you lifted up that he used the language of paradox, because we've talked, I think, in other sessions about, sort of who's telling the story, right? And how do we get those voices in from the margins? And for the last, 40 years, we have called what happened in 1968 or 69 the empowerment controversy. So by calling it controversy, we're already sort of lifting it up as a negative.
Right.
And by him shifting the language to the word paradox, I think it really can tell a different story about people's intentions and about, the misunderstanding and some of the backstory, I guess. So that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, recently some social justice work we were doing at our church around being white allies talked a lot about the difference between impact versus intent, and how you really need to be clear on and focused on your impact. And that's a kind of a white privilege thing to fall back on, to say, well, that's not what I meant, or you're too sensitive, you're taking it the wrong way. But at the same time, I think you have to create a safe space where people are not too scared to say anything for fear that they would offend. So yeah, I think it's if we see ourselves in partnership and growing towards a better place, then we can give ourselves that permission to do that work more fully, I guess. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of an approach you could have in religious education in general.
Yeah. And I just want to respond to your other point. One of the things that I have been in conversation with a couple of congregations who were in search for a religious educator is this idea of bringing the social justice work and the faith formation work together in one staff person, in one area. And part of what's driving that is this idea that we shoot ourselves in the foot, to use an inappropriate gun metaphor, so often, because we get locked into the action part of social activism. We get locked into what we're actually going to do rather than really, again, building a people who are equipped to go out into the world and do social activism. And that really what we should be focusing on in our congregations is that equipping process, is bringing people to that place where they can go out. And I'm not talking about organizing skills. I'm not talking about, those kinds of skills, but the maturity and the inner resources to be able to go out into the world and do the work, rather than us being the places where the work happens. Do you understand the distinction? So there's actually some congregations that have been looking at how do we bring those two ideas together in one staff person. So we'll see what happens with that. So Sadie, did I go out of order? I may have gone out of order were we supposed to finish the origin stories first?
Nope. Well, I've got the next, which is just continuing stories, but there's different questions. It's about, it's the next slide. So
okay. Well, I don't think I put any questions on the next slide. Is there anything else, any last thoughts on this sharing the history? All right, we're going to move forward, but I don't think I wrote the questions. I think I just used.
Okay. Oh, so there actually are a couple of questions here.
Okay.
What I'd like to do here is we'll go through the list, and this is kind of our wrap-up question for the session. And so which stories or events make you proud to be Unitarian Universalists? And which stories are you longing to share? Or maybe you already have shared these stories. So let's think of, there were so many stories in this session. I'd love to hear from each of you which one you'd like to highlight. And it could be what makes you proud. It could be another way of framing this, or what are some of your dreams for Unitarian Universalism, especially dreams that continue and to continue some of the work that's already begun in the past 50 years. So sort of dreams and hopes for Unitarian Universalism, and what stories would you like to lift up from that? Or what are you proud of from the stories that you've read this session? So what I'd like to do for this is we'll go down the list, because I'd love to get a chance to hear from everyone. And I'm just going to go in the order that I have on my roster. So we'll start, the first three people will be Terry, Courtney, and Meredith. And then I'll write the names in the chat box for the following order. Okay, so Terry, what stories are you proud of? What would you like to share? Dreams?
Well, the one that, Selma is probably the one that comes to mind as just proud, of what happened with the Unitarian Universalists at Selma. Mm-hmm. And so, and then I think even in going back to Theodore Parker and, hiding slaves and, standing up, the abolitionists standing up, the women's rights movement. I mean, there's a lot to be proud of. Olympia Brown in her work, Margaret Fuller. So what were the other dreams?
Yeah, so what are some dreams you have for Universalism? What would you like to see continue? What stories aren't yet finished?
Well, I mean, I think that we are, I guess, as I was thinking about final projects, I had some unanswered threads to this unit, and one of them was around Native Americans, because we didn't really talk at all about that, and we just passed at General Assembly a resolution on rethinking or Thanksgiving, and it calls for us to really dive deep into the history of Native Americans in America, and asking truth and reconciliation around that. And so I think there's work of our own history to do around that, and as well as moving forward and healing that piece. And I think about how there's a lot of work going on right now of partnering with Native Americans for climate action. And I see us really moving forward in that. So that's one of my personal dreams. It's actually what I put down as a final project piece, and I haven't figured out
Okay. Oh, that's, oh, you're kind of froze. That sounds
Exactly.
awesome. Can everybody hear me? I'm wondering if it's just,
We
okay. Okay. Let's move to Courtney.
Okay. So I don't even know where to start with a favorite story.
Do you have one that you want to tell? One you read and said, ooh, I want to tell this.
To our congregation?
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the stories that that really mesh with American history, because I think a lot of our congregation and myself too had known the stories of the early times, the Council of Nicaea and the King Sigismund, or I can never pronounce his name, Michael Servetus. But I don't think people are aware of that, the very American nature of the type of Unitarian Universalism we practice here in this country. And I know it's very different from what is practiced in Great Britain and in Prague and in Geneva. So I don't know how to boil it down to just one story. I thought every story I read was just fascinating. I loved the stories of the missed opportunities. I loved the way those were framed as missed opportunities rather than trying to shove something in just so that we can tell a story about someone who's got a different color or a different gender, because that always feels false to me. So I loved the way they did that. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
No, that's okay. You just have a lot of stories to tell.
And I'm going to tell them. I'm going to use the books and tell them during Time for All Ages this year. So yay, thank you.
Yay, awesome. All right, Meredith, and then Jansen is after Meredith.
One of the things that I'm so proud of Unitarian Universalism for is the developing about your sexuality, and then working with the United Church of Christ to develop the Our Whole Lives program, and that they had it be comprehensive really across the lifespan. I'm really proud of that and all the work around that. And then as far as going forward, almost 2 years ago at the Laredo Fall Con, somebody stood up and said that basically we need to do, like, what we've done with sexuality, we need to do with money. And I totally agreed with that. As that ties into all these issues that we're talking about with class. I think it ties into when we talk about social activism, our ability to do social justice work is somewhat dependent on our own financial security. So to have young people coming out of school with a lot of debt can sometimes put pressure to do the 9-to-5 grind when, if they didn't have those student loans, maybe they would feel more free to do activist work. Similar things of just being bound by debt, I see as an issue that kind of sways people to not always do what's morally right, but do what they feel like they have to do to get by. And then it relates to our congregations, obviously, and how we talk about money and how we interact with money in our congregations. So there's a lot there, but I'd love to see us do more work around money and economics.
Sure, definitely. Thanks. Jansen's next, and then Michelle after Jansen.
Well, in addition to what everybody has already said, I am proud of our religious education heritage that goes back to before FOS, but the way we transformed religious education into a child-centered program, I think is just tremendous. and you know, the idea that Foz states of being life is religious when we make it so. I mean, that's something that I really live by. In terms of my dream, I guess just sort of healing our racial past is something that I would love to see happen. And I think we're on that path, but there's so much to do. I mean, if our congregation is like so many, is virtually white, and I think for many of them, it doesn't bother them, or it's not something that they feel like they have to do anything about. So I dream of having the congregation that I work for reach out to members of the Hispanic community that we're sort of nestled within, and really having a much more diverse congregation.
Thanks, Jansen. Michelle, and then Bart, and then Lane. You still on the phone, Michelle?
Yep. Yeah, I'm here.
Good.
Yeah, I was really excited about the story of the youth and the religious educators sort of coming together pre-merge and starting to do curriculum together and bringing the youth groups together. That just seemed like a big score for me. I thought that was exciting. And I was going to say, similar to what Jansen said, all the different stories about the different educators with their philosophy of child first and, asking, questions to, guide towards, a particular answer or response. I think that came from Branson Alcott. The stories of Angus MacLean were really interesting to me, because I'm always hearing, I hadn't actually really learned much about him, but, I'm familiar with Mark Hicks, and he's the Angus MacLean professor at Meadville Lombard, and so I hear the name all the time, but it was like I didn't really realize his contributions to, to our faith, and so I thought that was really interesting. And then this Sunday, I'm actually telling, it was the Tapestry of Faith story on, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it was the story on Thomas Starr King. And I'm telling that this Sunday, and I just, something about that story just really fascinated me about how, he was kind of the first Unitarian Universalist before Unitarian Universalists, existed. And so I thought that was interesting, but so many of the stories just really, really fascinated me, and there's, and really put things in a context, even just looking around at the congregations and the way that they form and the attitudes that people have about, policy making or, having their, their free will and everything. It's really interesting because now I'm starting to see, the historical context of these things, and that, a lot of the stuff that comes up over and over again is not new. And as far as dreams or hopes, I have a lot of concern that maybe we're not, as a denomination, moving fast enough, sort of with the times, and that that I hope we really put some energy into a lot of the generational theories and just the way that the world has changed in the last 10 years and the way that it's going to change, and trying to keep our congregation, you know, up with that and being able to change with them, because I find that, you know, change happens pretty slowly in our congregations.
Mm. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks. Bart and then Lane. How you feeling, Bart? Are you up for sharing?
Yeah, I can share. So I'm proud of a lot of our Unitarian Universalist history, but I think the story that I'd like to share more often would be stories about how, you know, the Our Whole Lives type stories. You know, I don't tend to talk about that one very often, and even when I talk about the merger, to be honest, I had no idea that the religious educators did it first before the youth, and I've always been telling it that the youth have done it first. And honestly, I still might, but I might hint a little bit to give the RE folks in the room a little bit of cred. But I think those are the, you know, we need to look for our own modern day prophets within Unitarian Universalism. And sometimes we get hung up in the past. And I think even looking in the past 50 years shows us that we don't have to go all the way back. Actually, just at summer seminary, we were talking about how some of the staff had met and knew James Luther Adams. And like the youth were like, wait, I thought he died like 100 years ago. You know, and they were surprised, you know, when I was talking about Sophia Faz about, you know, she was ordained when she was like 81. Like, she was old. You don't have to, you know, be a minister right out of college, right out of grad school. You can wait 50 years. Hopefully, you'll have the chance to wait 50 years. So, you know, those stories, and even, and I was surprised, you know, some of the stories I think we need to also talk about are the older ones too. A bunch of the youth had no idea who Francis David was. Or Michael Severitis, and we were at Star King, so we got to go into the rare book room and look at, you know, one of Severitis's books. So to, you know, bring back some of that and to not necessarily, well, and I'd like to lift up the stories, you know, like Ethelred Brown and some of the ways that we failed in the past as a way to show that, you know, we can make mistakes, we can stumble, but it's how we recover from that stumble to continue moving on, you know?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Bart. I mean, I don't have much to add to all your stories. I'm just saying yes. I think these are great. I love hearing all this. All right, so Lane and then Deborah Eve.
The readings this time for me were fascinating. I loved so many of them. It's very hard for me to pick one. I found myself just agreeing with a lot of what was happening, getting excited for things that were happening. I really loved reading the Southern Unitarian Universalists in the Civil Rights era. I thought that was a fascinating read. And then to hear about, was it Donald Thompson when they, in Jackson, within that, when they were offered to move him and he was like, nah. And then also with the empowerment controversy, I loved reading about them taking the microphones. And my boss had actually made a joke about that a few weeks ago, so it was pretty funny timing that this was one of the readings. And then dreams for me, a couple of things that were mentioned. I loved hearing that we're looking at Native Americans and working at that. That is a voice that isn't really heard a lot in UU. And then when you do, it's RE curriculum from the past that I kind of have issues with personally that I've had great discussions with my boss about. And it's like, we have these on the shelf and what do we do with them? We don't feel we can use them right now. So I think that conversation absolutely needs to happen. And I would love to get more information about that. And then also it was mentioned earlier about making how do we make the congregations less white? Because that's something that I've noticed as well. And I've gone to congregations across the country, and it is an overwhelmingly white denomination that I've noticed so far. And I don't know if that's just where I've happen to go, but it's been kind of all over the place. So that's been an interesting. And that's something that's in the church that I work in now as well. We've been making improvement and stride, but we're still mostly a Caucasian denomination right now. So,
Thanks, Lane. Those are a bunch of different pieces. Okay, Deborah, Eve, and then Scarlett, and then lastly Karina. Oh, we lost you. You still there? We can't quite hear you. Let's move to Scarlett and then see if we can get back to Deborah Eve. Scarlett, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I was trying to remember after listening to everyone what the questions were.
So I can recap. So what makes you proud, and what stories you want to tell, and what dreams do you have for UUism?
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So the thing is that
by the story of in Selma, a woman, I thought I had marked the page, who went down and helped register voters, and her story about getting to the airport and being chased by the Ku Klux Klan. Because I think sometimes, I think that's a good story for the youth and for all of us.
That's Viola Liuzzo, probably.
They knew that they were going to be watched, their every move and everything, but they still went to help protect the liberties of the people, black people, so they could register to vote. And that's kind of an exciting story, too. So, them getting chased and all. So that would appeal to them. And it's just amazing that they were willing to do that in the early 60s, because women still didn't really have a lot of rights in the 60s. And the another story that really I was just amazed at was Minister Jones, black minister, who, when he left the pulpit, him saying his quote, and I thought I'm going to have to share his story. To paraphrase, he had said he was shocked about, he thought he was in New England and had liberal Unitarianism, and that everyone felt different. But then he didn't feel outright hate. He pitied us. There was a tinge of pity, and he could only wonder how people got this way. And I've heard that. I've heard other people of color say a similar thing today, like how did they get this way? And I just think about today what African Americans think, and think of white people, and think of how they have to accomplish things, the kind of force, what kinds of force they have to use to be heard. So, I don't know. I have to kind of think about those some more, but I was really impressed by what he said after we were not really very open to him being a minister.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for lifting that up. I remember rereading that same collection again. Deborah Eve, can we try again with you? Is that you on the phone?
Yes.
Okay, we hear you now.
Sorry about that. I guess I'm just thinking more about how to tell these stories as stories about real people and people who are innovators and who are creative. And probably, the part that we haven't really read about is that they would have met opposition all the way through. It's only with hindsight that they get put up on pedestals. So somehow to try to communicate that. And then I think it was Sophia Fawaz who said that stories should be told with emotion, to try and tell the stories as though they are real people with real things happening to them, and not just from the perspective of these are the people who we remember. So I'm thinking a lot of the women. I'm still thinking about Louisa May Alcott complaining that the women were left to work in the garden while the men went off and raised funds for their school. Hosea Ballou, poor Eugene Sparrow, and Everett Brown. But I guess to me it'd be really fascinating, because I'm going to try and tell some for stories for all ages, is to also try to find ways to work in children into the story, so they're not only about adults. Sort of what other people have said, that it needs to be multi-generational. Mm-hmm. So this week we're actually in our fellowship. We are going to have some of our children interview some of our elders and do some oral histories on videotape, and then share them as a service, just to get people thinking more about history and kind of start more locally and then work back into this larger history.
Oh, I love that. That's cool. Thanks. And I want to get a chance to hear from Karina, and then we'll do a closing and hear a little bit more about your projects if anyone has questions.
So this is a very privileged position to be in, to go last and hear what everybody else said. And I think the thread that runs through all these stories is that we are a movement and a faith that has moved forward constantly through people's ability to have the courage of their convictions. And I would say that for me, the thing I'm most proud of is that we've been willing to be that heretic, right? That we dared to say, let's see if we can mute somebody. Somebody's typing, and then it sounds like someone on the phone too. Anyway, okay. So yeah, that people had that within them. So there's a lot of strength to draw on from our forebears, that they were willing to place themselves often in a place of ridicule and insecurity to stay with what they felt was true. And then we found and created communities that offered some sort of safety and comfort in those convictions, that we could be together. And we were intentional and did that ourselves and created those communities that would offer that to us. So I think that's also something that we can be really proud of. Now, I think where we fall down is when those communities become a little bit too comfortable, and then we don't feel like we need to go out further. So I would say a dream for me for this denomination is that we take that strength that we've had over time to be on the forefront of challenging thought, current thought, or conventional thought, and transform that into a radical hospitality that brings more and more people into what we're doing. And that, I think, is a lot of really internal work that we have to do about getting, even though we may be safe with one another, that we can do a lot more to have bring people into that safety with us. And that means perhaps letting go of that control and being able to feel okay and be brave again. So it's kind of like a full circle kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not brave in an outward way, but be brave amongst each other so that we can be transformed, I guess.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Karina, for wrapping it up for us. So yeah, we don't actually have a lot more time to do more stories. I hope that's okay. We've got a closing reading, and what I would like to do is take a time to answer some questions about the final project before we do that. And I know we asked you to submit your proposal before this class, and I don't think we've heard from everybody. I think we almost have. So if you haven't had a chance, or if we haven't written back to you yet, if you could hang on the line. I was just thinking we could do that right at the end of the class. Pat, does that work for you? Sure. I can't hear you, but I can read your lips. So does anyone have any questions about the final project? Just that might be good for everyone to hear, or should we want to do just individual questions? All right, if we don't have any big questions about the final project, let's do the reading, and then we can just do one by one, check it in with people. So here comes the closing reading. And do we have a volunteer who'd like to read our closing words?
Sure. I can read it.
Okay.
This is Scarlett. I'm going to read it out of the hymnal.
Okay.
Let religion be to us life and joy. Let it be a voice of renewing challenge to the best we have and may be. Let it be a call to generous action. Let religion be to us a dissatisfaction with things that are, which bids us serve more eagerly the true and right. Let it be the sorrow that opens for us the way of sympathy, understanding, and service to suffering humanity. Let religion be to us the wonder and door of that which is only partly known and understood, an eye that glories in nature's majesty and beauty, and a heart that rejoices in deeds of kindness and of courage. Let religion be to us security and serenity because of its truth and beauty, and because of the enduring worth and power of the loyalties which it engenders. Let it be to us hope and purpose and a discovering of opportunity to express our best through daily tasks. Religion, uniting us with all that is admirable in human beings everywhere, holding before our eyes a prospect of a better life for humankind, which each may help to make actionable.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So I would love to go. Let's go in just reverse order of what we just did. So Karina, are you set with have you sent in your proposal? Can you remind us what it is?
Yes, Lane and I are working together on a kind of enhanced timeline that will provide more social and cultural context to the events that we describe as part of our UU history. So people can see perhaps the more radical side of what, or within that greater context, it can be seen that what UUs were proposing and doing at those different times were quite out of the norm.
Yeah, awesome. Did you get my note about the other ways of making a timeline?
Yeah.
I think that might be an option for you guys, or do you want to stick with a PowerPoint?
I don't know. I'll have to think about it. I don't know if it's going to be just more general categories, and if the timeline thing forces me to put in specific dates, I don't know if I want to go that deep.
Okay, it might not work. Okay. Cool. Well, I can't wait to see it. Scarlett, what's your thoughts for your project? You sent one in today, is that right?
Scarlett,
Am I in?
frozen.
I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Oh, you sent. I've got yours right here that you sent.
So, do you want me to tell you what it was?
No, I've got it. So you want to do the secret, is this the secret people, secret pals?
Yes.
With the historic persona and the current one?
Yes.
Great.
I think that sounds awesome. So do you know how you're planning to present that to us in a presentation?
I'm going to see how well I can come up with starting to do a PowerPoint or maybe a collection of videos of short clips about some of the
Very
For each
historical
persona,
figure.
that's what you said.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm excited about this. This sounds great.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Do you have any questions for us? Are you good?
I'm good.
Okay, great, thanks. And Deborah Eve? Let's see. Did you get to see Deborah Eves in the doc? Do we have it in there? Yes.
We did receive something from her, yes.
Okay. Here's the story for all ages. Lives here.
We may have lost her.
Okay.
I'm not seeing her name up there.
That sounds good. If she has any questions. And then Lane. Oh, and you're doing the joint one, Lane. And Art, you submitted something. Do you have any questions about yours? Yours was something you were going to do with youth, right? Are you still here? Maybe not. Nope, Art's gone. But he did submit something. And Michelle?
I'm doing a worship service in a game show format, sort of like a Jeopardy type thing with the categories.
Awesome.
And I'm going to present it in PowerPoint.
Okay. Great. Jansen, you said yours about the youth session or something, right?
It was a middle school curriculum, which I would hope to write one session, so that in preparation for a heritage trip, sort of get them sort of an overview of our historical figures and events.
Yeah, I think that's great. I remember you mentioning that was a need, and I think that's great that you can spend some time to help make that happen. Great. And then you'd share with us just one session of that.
Right.
That's perfect. Meredith, are you still here?
She is.
Okay.
Need to remember to unmute though. So I emailed the two of you a long, long time ago about matching Message for All Ages stories with the Soul Matters themes.
Yes, I remember that.
Year. And then I got totally inspired by the idea of a Chicago field trip and investigating different sites that would be relevant for that. So if it's okay with you, I will be unsure which one I will present, but I'll do a PowerPoint on whichever one I end up doing.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. They both sound like great things to have. So, okay, sounds good. And Courtney, she's still here?
Yeah. I sent something into the Google Doc, and it has to do with a tour of DC. Is a lot like what Meredith was just talking about. Because we can't get our kids to Boston, I'd love to be able to talk to do the tour of DC with some sites because we're 30 minutes away, and kind of talk about the integration of, as American history was building, so was Unitarian history and Universalist history. And I can imagine it being for adults, but also as a kind of a coming of age trip. And if that doesn't sound good, I would love to rewrite, backwards when I see it. I would love to rewrite this brochure for younger children.
Oh, great.
Oh, either of those. I think
Either of those sound fabulous.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you guys are all if at least two of you are thinking of local history trips. I think that's awesome. And your other idea, awesome too. So you have a choice to make. You both have choices to make. They both sound good.
Either one's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and if anyone's still online and wants to work with me, I would love a partner.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful.
I think we just have Terry left. Is that right? Or did Terry leave? Oh, Terry's
she's there.
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay.
And sorry.
Oh, hi, you're on your side.
I've been all over the place with this.
Yeah.
So, and I think I sent you like a full page, and then I've added to it and subtracted from it, and like trying to narrow it down. But because I love to research, and I started going down the road of researching our history with Native Americans, and I found a lot, and I found more than I even put on that sheet. I found something from Bill Sinkford apologizing for the Utes and the Unitarians. There's a speech I found about a boarding school that existed in the 1880s called Bond's Mission in Montana with Indians. And I'd love to just, because there's a group, so my thing is format. I want to do something on this topic and share it.
Okay.
But I'm just trying to narrow it down to something small. So I did live on a reservation, Pine Ridge Reservation, for a year, and there's a youth group near me that's going there in April. And it's not my group, but I am a resource for them. So I'm thinking of just putting some information together. So a larger project is all this information, like a timeline.
Yeah.
And a smaller project is something more focused on the youth for their trip. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to present to this group, but it's,
Time will be your guide.
That's cool.
Yes.
And I know I don't have everyone here on the phone on the call, but I just had an idea that a lot of these projects can be, seeds to like a much bigger project, which might be great options for grants from like the Unitarian Sunday School Society or the Universalist Sunday School Society or Loretta for curriculum development and projects. So if this is something that you're just starting, and it's beyond what you can do with your current position and your time, I want to look into at the end of our session next time, I'll share the resources of where you can look for grants and apply for stuff.
Great.
And I also want to remind us all that we have a very limited time for these presentations. So, in some respects, what we are asking you to do really is to put together an outline of what you think would be valuable and to really just highlight for us one piece of it, right? So we don't want you to go through, a whole, necessarily a whole long presentation, because we really literally have 10 minutes per presentation and we need to get a little bit of feedback to you on that. If you want to do something longer, and you want to, I can set up a Zoom meeting for you, and you can, do a little video that really goes into more depth on your project that we can, put in the library there on the web page for folks to look at later, just in terms of our actual class session. Very, very scrunched.
Right, yeah, because it looks like we've got 9 presentations. That's 13 minutes per person, so that includes feedback time and presentation.
Yeah, so basically a 10-minute presentation. I also see Jansen throwing out a little proposal there to maybe work with some folks who are thinking about, to maybe have one sort of process for a local trip, and then maybe each one have a little highlight of your particular geography.
Yeah,
that would be Courtney and Meredith. And I think Meredith has left us. So there is a place on the forum to do that, or we can send an email.
I'll put it up on the forum.
Great.
Okay, sounds great.
Yay. Cool.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Yeah, great session. Thank you all.
Thank you all.